The rain came down sideways through the pines behind base housing, the kind of cold, gray Carolina drizzle that soaks a kid's hoodie before he even knows he's wet. And 9-year-old Eli Marsh was halfway to the creek with a peanut butter sandwich in his pocket when he heard the cough. Not a kid cough. Not a dog. A man's cough, low and wet and tired, the way his grandpa coughed in the mornings before he'd had his coffee. Eli stopped on the Pine Needle Trail, water dripping off the brim of his Carolina Panthers cap, and he listened the way his grandpa had taught him to listen, with his whole body still. There it was again. Off to the left, past the dogwood thicket, somewhere near the old water tower the base had stopped using back when his mom was a kid. Eli was not supposed to go past the dogwoods. His mom had said it 100 times. But the cough came a third time, and this time there was a word stitched into it, hoarse and broken, and the word was, help. Eli's hand closed around the sandwich in his pocket like it was a lifeline, and he stepped off the trail. Stay with me on this one. What he found in the clearing under the water tower stopped his heart for a full second, the way a deer stops when it sees a hunter. 4 old men. 4 of them sitting in a half circle around the trunk of a big loblolly pine, their backs against the bark, their wrists wrapped in heavy gray chain that ran behind the trunk and locked them all together like a bad nightmare. They were soaked to the bone. One had a Vietnam ball cap pulled low. One had a beard the color of old snow. One had only one leg below the knee, the empty pant leg pinned up neat the way his grandpa did it on Sunday. And the fourth, sitting closest to Eli, with a square jaw and pale blue eyes the color of pool water in December, was his grandpa. Eli's whole body went hot, and then cold and then hot again. Grandpa, he whispered. The pale blue eyes lifted slow, the way Eli had seen them lift 1,000 times over a coffee cup, and they focused on him, and his grandpa, Sergeant Major Henry Marsh, United States Marine Corps, retired, opened his cracked lips and said in a voice like gravel under a boot, boy. You run. You run and you get the MPs. You hear me? You run, but Eli did not run. Not yet. He took 2 steps closer instead, looked at his grandpa's wrists, and he saw the dark red ring of raw skin where the chain had been chewing all night, and something inside a 9-year-old boy decided, right there in the wet pine needles, that whoever did this was going to pay. He pulled out his sandwich first. He pulled out the peanut butter sandwich, wrapped in a paper towel his mom had folded into a perfect square, and he broke it into 4 pieces with his small wet hands, and he walked from old man to old man and pressed a piece into each set of bound fingers like he was passing out communion. The man with the white beard cried without making a sound. The one-legged man laughed, a single dry bark of a laugh, and said, Semper Fi, little brother. The Vietnam cap whispered, God bless you, son. And his grandpa, who had not cried in front of him a single time in 9 years of life, closed his pale blue eyes and let one tear cut a clean line through the dirt on his cheek. Then Eli ran. He ran the way his grandpa had taught him to run, head up, breath through the nose, arms tight, the steady hammering pace of a Marine on a road march. 2 miles back through the wet woods. Past the dogwoods. Past the creek. Across the soccer field behind the elementary school. Up the gravel drive of base housing row 14. He hit the front door of the gate shack so hard the duty MP, Corporal Diaz, spilled her coffee across the logbook. Ma'am, Eli said, because his grandpa had told him you call a woman in uniform ma'am whether she likes it or not. My grandpa is chained to a tree in the woods. Him and 3 other Marines. To a tree. In the rain. You need to come right now. Corporal Diaz, 23 years old and 16 hours on duty, looked at this small soaked child and did not laugh. She had been a Marine for 5 years, and she knew a real face when she saw one. She picked up the radio. Sergeant of the Guard, this is Gate 3. I need a 4-man patrol and corpsman rolling to the old water tower behind row 14, possible 4 down. Witness on scene is a juvenile. Send Lieutenant Park over. She hung up the radio. She looked at Eli. Son, what's your name? Eli. Eli, your grandpa Jarhead. Sergeant Major, ma'am. Retired. Corporal Diaz nodded once slow. Then we are going to go get him. You ride up front. Buckle in. We do not stop. Understood, Eli understood. He climbed into the Humvee. The rain hit the windshield like nails. Lieutenant Park got to the water tower 3 minutes ahead of them. By the time Eli and Corporal Diaz came skidding through the wet pine needles in the green Humvee, there were already 2 corpsmen kneeling in the mud with bolt cutters and warming blankets, and Park, all 6'4" of him, was standing over the 4 old men with his hands on his hips and a look on his face Eli would remember for the rest of his life. It was not anger. It was something older and quieter than anger. The look his grandpa got when somebody at the VFW post talked bad about a fallen friend. The chains came off one wrist at a time, slow and careful, because the skin underneath was torn. Each old man was wrapped in a foil blanket. Each old man was lifted, with 2 Marines under each arm and walked, not carried, because they all 4 refused to be carried, to the back of an ambulance. The white-bearded one stopped at the bumper. He turned. He looked at Park. "Sir, you have a boy here who saved 4 lives today. You remember his name?" Park looked down at Eli. "I will, Gunny." "On my honor," and then he saluted. He saluted a 9-year-old in a soaked Carolina Panthers cap, full hand, full elbow, full Marine Corps salute, and Eli, because his grandpa had taught him this too, brought his small wet hand up and returned it. There were 6 grown Marines standing in that clearing. Not one of them said a word for a long, long moment. The 4 old men were taken to the base hospital, not to the VA in town. That detail mattered, although Eli did not know yet why. His grandpa was kept overnight for hypothermia, and Eli's mom, Sarah Marsh, a charge nurse at the same base hospital, sat in the plastic chair next to his bed, holding his hand and crying in the careful, silent way nurses cry when they do not want the patient to know. Eli sat on the foot of the bed, eating a turkey sandwich a corpsman had brought him, and he watched his grandpa breathe. Around 8 that night, Sergeant Major Henry Marsh, with a bag of warmed saline in his arm and a foil blanket still tucked around his chest, looked at his daughter and his grandson, cleared his throat and said, "Sarah, I have to tell you where we came from. And it is not going to be easy to hear." Sarah did not let go of his hand. "Then tell me, Daddy." And Henry Marsh, who had 2 purple hearts and a silver star in a shadow box on his living room wall, started to talk. Slow, careful, voice like gravel under a boot. He had been at the VA assisted living facility, just off base for 3 months. Sarah had moved him in after his second small stroke, when it was clear he could not safely live alone in the little brick house anymore. The facility was supposed to be the good one. The one with brochures full of smiling old men in fishing hats. The one the base commander himself had recommended. Henry had hated it from day one, but he had bitten his tongue because Sarah was tired, and Sarah was raising Eli alone, and Sarah needed him to be safe. He told Sarah how the night staff had changed about 6 weeks back. How the new ones did not look you in the eye when they spoke. How the food trays started coming late, then cold, then sometimes not at all. How a Marine named Curtis Webb, the one-legged man from the tree, had asked one too many times where his missing watch had gone. How a sailor named Tom Becker, the white-bearded man from the tree, had complained about the bedsores nobody would treat. How a Vietnam Marine named Earl Tisdale, the man in the ball cap from the tree, had told a daughter on a phone call that he was hungry, and how the next morning Earl's phone had disappeared from his nightstand and never come back. Henry told them how, the night before, around 2 in the morning, 4 men in dark clothes had come into their rooms one by one, had told them they were being transferred, had loaded them into a windowless van, and had driven them out into the woods behind the base and chained them to a tree. They said, Henry told his daughter, and I am going to remember the exact words until the day I die, they said, "You old men talk too much. The cold will quiet you down. By morning, somebody will find some bodies and write it up as wandered off and lost, and that will be the end of it." Then they walked back to the van. And they drove away. Sarah Marsh, charge nurse, age 34, daughter of a Marine, did not cry. Her face went still and cold the way a winter pond goes still, and she stood up very slowly and she said, "Daddy, I am going to make some phone calls." She called Corporal Diaz at the gate first, because Eli had told her about Diaz. Diaz picked up on the first ring. Sarah said, "Corporal, this is Sarah Marsh. Henry Marsh's daughter. I need you to do me a favor above your pay grade. I need Lieutenant Park's cell number." Diaz did not hesitate. "Ma'am, I will text it to you in 90 seconds, Sarah called Park. Park, who had been pacing his on-base apartment for 6 hours, picked up before the second ring. Sarah told him everything Henry had told her. Park listened without speaking for 9 straight minutes. When she was done, Park said, "Mrs. Marsh, I need your permission to wake my company commander and his battalion commander. And if it comes to it, the colonel." Sarah said, "Lieutenant, you wake the entire Marine Corps if you have to." Park said, "Yes, ma'am." By 4 in the morning, the colonel had ordered a quiet preservation of the chains, the bolt cutters, and the tire tracks at the water tower. He had also ordered something else. Something that, in his 31 years of wearing the uniform, he had never ordered before. He had ordered the base provost marshal to put a discreet but absolute lock on the VA assisted living facility just off the gate, and to do it before sunrise, so that not one staff member could leave, and not one record could be shredded, and not one elderly resident could be moved, until the Marines themselves had walked every hallway. The provost marshal said, "Sir, the VA is not under our jurisdiction." The colonel said, "Major, you and I are going to find out exactly what is under our jurisdiction today." Move. The major moved. Sunrise came up gray and slow over the Carolina pines, and at 6:15 in the morning, 2 Humvees and 1 unmarked sedan rolled into the parking lot of the Whispering Pines VA assisted living facility, and out of them stepped the base provost marshal, 2 military police investigators, 1 civilian sheriff's deputy whose cousin happened to be a Marine, and the colonel himself, in his utility uniform with his eagles polished. They walked through the front door without knocking. The night supervisor, a thin man in a wrinkled polo shirt named Dwight, stood up too fast from the front desk and tried to ask what this was about. The colonel did not answer him. The colonel walked past him, down the long beige hallway, opening every door, slow and careful, looking in on every old man and every old woman in every bed, the way a father walks through a nursery checking on sleeping children. In one room he found a Marine veteran of Korea lying in his own urine. In another, he found a Navy chief with a pressure sore the size of a saucer. In another, he found an Army Ranger who had not been given his heart medication in 2 days, and whose lips were blue. In another, he found an empty bed, and a clipboard at the foot of it that said the resident had been transferred at 2:17 that morning to an off-site location. The colonel stood at the foot of that empty bed for a long time. Then he turned around and he walked back down the beige hallway, and he stopped in front of Dwight. And he said, in a voice so quiet Dwight had to lean in, "Son, you are going to sit down in that chair. You are going to keep both your hands flat on top of that desk where my MPs can see them. And you are going to begin, right now, to tell my investigator the name of every single person who was on shift last night, every single person who has been on shift for the last 6 weeks, and every single person whose idea this was. And if you leave out one name, son, I am personally going to make sure you spend the rest of your natural life in the smallest federal cell they can find. Are we understood?" Dwight nodded. Dwight understood. But here is the thing, the part that built in the days that followed like a slow drum. The chaining of the 4 old men had not been some random act of cruelty by underpaid night staff. As Dwight talked, and as a supervisor named Marcy talked, and as a young aide named Brandon who had started crying in the parking lot before the MPs even reached him talked, a picture came together that was uglier than anything the colonel or Sarah Marsh had braced themselves for. Whispering Pines had been, for almost a year, the quiet downstream end of a small and profitable operation. A network. 4 men, 2 of them former orderlies fired from VA hospitals up in Virginia, 1 a licensed administrator who had bounced through 3 states under 3 slightly different name spellings, and 1, the worst one, a man who held a real federal contract to oversee veteran transitional care in the entire region. 4 men in suits and polos who had figured out that an old veteran with a fixed pension and a foggy mind and no family in town was a small steady cash machine You could milk for everything from his monthly check to his pain medication to his wedding ring, too. Eventually, his life insurance payout if you could just get him to wander off in the woods one cold night and not come back. They had been doing it slow. One every few months. Different facilities. Different stories. Wandered off. Heart attack on a walk. Fell in the parking lot. The 4 old men chained to the loblolly pine had been the next 4 on the list, picked because they had started asking questions the 4 men in suits did not want answered. Henry Marsh, Curtis Webb, Tom Becker, and Earl Tisdale had been chained to a tree in the rain, by paid hands working under quiet orders, because 4 old jarheads and 1 old sailor had refused to shut up. And the only reason they were not all 4 already buried in unmarked county graves was a 9-year-old boy in a Carolina Panthers cap who had heard a cough in the woods and had decided not to keep walking. Word of what had happened did not spread on the base in whispers in the chow hall. It spread the way fire spreads through dry pine. By Wednesday afternoon, every Marine on that base, all 12,000 of them, knew the broad strokes. A boy. A tree. Chains. A VA facility. 4 old veterans. By Wednesday night, every non-commissioned officer in II Marine Expeditionary Force knew the names. Sergeant Major Henry Marsh. Gunnery Sergeant Curtis Webb. Senior Chief Tom Becker. Staff Sergeant Earl Tisdale. By Thursday morning, the first sergeants of the 3 infantry battalions stationed on base had, without coordinating among themselves, posted the same handwritten note outside each of their company offices. The note in 3 different handwritings said the same 3 lines. We do not leave our old behind. Formation Friday 0700, Base Parade Deck. Wear your blues. By Thursday afternoon, the colonel had been told, very politely by his own sergeant major, that the formation was going to happen whether the colonel approved it on paper or not, but that it would be cleaner all around if he did. The colonel approved it. Friday morning came up clear and cold, the rain finally gone, the parade deck slick with the last of the dew, and at 0645 the buses started rolling. Buses from every barracks. Buses from Headquarters Battalion. Buses from the School of Infantry. Buses from the Engineer Battalion and the Artillery Battalion, and the Air Wing across the river. The Marines were in their dress blues. White covers. White gloves. Blood striped down the trouser. Every rank from boot private to lieutenant colonel, in the same blue wool that Henry Marsh had worn for 30 years. They did not march onto the deck in formation. They walked. Quietly. Boots on wet concrete. They walked the way men walk into a church for a friend's funeral, with their heads up and their faces still. By 0658, the parade deck, which on a normal review day held maybe 400 or 500 Marines, was packed shoulder to shoulder with closer to 2,000. 2,000 Marines. Standing at parade rest. Waiting. There was no band. There was no rifle line. There was just a single folding table at the front, draped in a thin Marine Corps red cloth, 4 folding chairs behind it, the colonel standing at the side waiting, and a small wet-headed 9-year-old boy in his only good clip-on tie next to the colonel, holding his mother's hand. The 4 old men came out of the side door of the headquarters building at exactly 0700. They came out walking. That was Henry Marsh's one demand from his hospital bed, that none of them would be wheeled or carried or pushed. Curtis Webb had borrowed a prosthetic better than his usual one from the base prosthetics shop, and he walked on it with a slight roll but no cane. Tom Becker had on a fresh white beard trim, and his Navy Chief's combination cover that he had not worn in 11 years, and that still fit. Earl Tisdale had on his Vietnam cap with the unit pin on the front. And Henry Marsh, Sergeant Major Henry Marsh, his pale blue eyes clear as pool water in December, walked out front, his shoulders set the way they had been set on 100 parade decks before this one. The 4 old men crossed the wet concrete slow. The 2,000 Marines watching them did not move, did not breathe, did not blink. And then, when the 4 old men reached the center of the deck and stopped, the colonel did not give the command. The colonel did not need to. From somewhere in the very back of that crowd, from a voice no one ever quite identified later, a single deep word came rolling forward across 2,000 heads. Attention! 2,000 pairs of heels snapped together in one single crack like a rifle shot. 2,000 white-gloved hands came up at once, fingertips to the brim of 2,000 white covers, in the slow, full, deliberate hand salute of the United States Marine Corps. Held, not the snap and drop of a parade. The full, long-held salute, reserved for the dead and the deserving. Held for 10 full seconds. The 4 old men in the center returned it. Henry Marsh's hand was steady. Curtis Webb's was steady. Tom Becker's was steady. Earl Tisdale's was steady. 2,000 hands came down at once. Then the part the colonel had not planned, the part that just happened, the company first sergeant started walking forward. One by one. Each one carrying something small. The first sergeant from 1st Battalion came up and laid down a folded camouflage utility blouse on the red cloth table, with his own name tape still sewn on, and he said, loud enough for the front rows to hear, "Sergeant Major Marsh. From the 1st Battalion. If you need a coat, you wear one of ours from now on." He stepped back. Saluted. Sat down on the wet concrete cross-legged like a private. The first sergeant from 2nd Battalion came up and laid down a thick black wool watch cap. Gunny Webb. From 2nd Battalion. "Cold nights are over, Gunny." He stepped back. Saluted. Sat down. The first sergeant from 3rd Battalion came up and laid down a stainless steel coffee thermos with the eagle globe and anchor etched into the side, full and steaming. Senior Chief Becker. From the Jarheads. "We know you wore navy blue, but we claim you anyway, sir." Becker laughed, and then he cried, and then he laughed again. The first sergeant from Headquarters Battalion came up last and laid down a small wooden box with a brass Vietnam service ribbon glued to the lid, and inside it was a brand new cell phone, paid for and activated. Staff Sergeant Tisdale. From Headquarters. "If anybody ever takes your phone again, you call this number and 1,200 of us will be at your door before the man who took it can put on his shoes." He sat down. 2,000 Marines on a parade deck sitting, cross-legged like privates in dress blues on wet concrete. Nobody had ever seen anything like it. The colonel finally walked to the front. He did not have notes. He did not have a microphone. He had a voice that had carried over 3 combat zones, and he used it. "Marines," he said. "Sailors. Guests. 2 days ago, 4 of our own were chained to a tree in the woods behind this base by men who thought no one was watching. Men who thought our elders were disposable. Men who thought that because these 4 had taken off the uniform, they no longer wore it. They were wrong. The uniform does not come off. Not for these 4. Not for any of us. Today, at this very hour, federal agents working with our own MPs are arresting 4 men in suits and 7 of their hired hands on charges that include kidnapping, abuse of vulnerable adults, conspiracy, mail fraud, and attempted murder. Those 4 men in suits will spend the rest of their lives in a small cell with a small window, and they will think every single morning about the 4 old men they tried to kill and about the boy who would not let them. But that is not why we are here today. We are here today because we need our 4 old men to look out at this deck and see who they belong to. Sergeant Major Marsh. Gunny Webb. Senior Chief Becker. Staff Sergeant Tisdale. You belong to us. You will never live unguarded again. You will never eat alone again. You will never be cold or hungry or scared in this town again. There are 2,000 of us in front of you right now, and there are 10,000 more of us behind these walls, and we are, every last one of us, your family from this hour forward. Until further notice. Until the end of time. Semper Fi. A roar came up off that parade deck the like of which Eli Marsh would never forget for as long as he lived. A roar that bounced off the headquarters building and rolled across the soccer fields and out into the wet pines. And somewhere in the middle of that roar, his grandpa Henry turned, slow and careful, and looked down at him. Henry Marsh dropped to one knee on the wet concrete, in his good civilian suit jacket, with 2,000 Marines roaring behind him, and he put both hands on his grandson's small shoulders. The pale blue eyes were full but not spilling. The cracked voice was steady. "Eli," he said. "Boy, do you know what you did?" Eli shook his head. He had just heard a cough. "You saved 4 lives," Henry said. "You saved 4 lives and you started this. All of this. You hear me, son? You did this." Eli looked over his grandpa's shoulder at the 2,000 Marines in dress blues sitting cross-legged on wet concrete, at the 4 folded gifts on the red table, at the colonel standing with his eagles bright in the morning sun, at his mother Sarah with both hands pressed to her mouth and tears streaming down her face, and Eli, 9 years old, in a clip-on tie and slightly muddy church shoes, did the only thing he could think to do. He brought his small right hand up, fingertips to his eyebrow, full hand, full elbow, full Marine Corps salute. Held it. Steady. The way his grandpa had taught him. 2,000 Marines, still seated, brought their right hands up one more time and held the salute back. Held it. Steady. Held it for the boy. In the weeks that followed, the Whispering Pines VA assisted living facility was closed by federal order. Every single resident was relocated, one by one, to clean placements with on-base oversight, each one personally checked on by a rotating watch of volunteer Marines and sailors from the units that had stood on that parade deck. The 4 men in suits were arraigned, indicted, and 8 months later tried. All 4 were convicted on every count. The licensed administrator, the one with the federal contract, got the longest sentence the judge could give him, and the judge, an old Army Ranger himself, looked the man in the eye at sentencing and said, "Sir, some men forfeit their right to walk free among us. You are one of those men. May God help you, because this court will not." The 7 hired hands took plea deals and got 12 to 20 each. Curtis Webb, the one-legged gunny, moved in with Sarah and Eli into the small back bedroom that used to be a sewing room, and he taught Eli how to clean a deer rifle and how to make pancakes the size of a hubcap on Sunday mornings. Tom Becker, the white-bearded senior chief, moved into a small cottage 3 doors down on base, housing row 14. Earl Tisdale, the Vietnam Marine in the ball cap, was set up in a clean small apartment on the other side of the base near the chapel, and every Sunday morning 2 privates in civvies came by to pick him up and walk him over to the service, and they were never the same 2 privates because every private in his battalion had signed up on a rotating schedule that ran out 3 years on the calendar. And Sergeant Major Henry Marsh, who had been near to dying in cold rain in the pines behind base housing on a Tuesday afternoon, walked his grandson Eli to school every single morning for the next 4 years, holding his hand at first and then, when Eli got too big for that, walking beside him with his hands clasped behind his back the way old Marines walk, the pale blue eyes scanning the trees on either side of the path the way old Marines scan. There's a small brass plaque on the loblolly pine in the woods behind the old water tower now. The base put it up quietly, no ceremony, the spring after it all happened. It does not name the 4 old men. It does not name the 4 men in suits. It does not name the Colonel or Lieutenant Park or Corporal Diaz. It names in small block letters 1 person, and underneath the name it has 1 short line. The name is Eli Marsh. The line says, "He heard the cough and he did not keep walking." Marines on training runs through those woods to this day, slow down when they reach the tree. They do not always know the whole story. The good ones ask. The older sergeants tell it. And every single one of them, before they pick the pace back up and head on down the trail, comes to a halt at the base of that loblolly pine, brings the right hand up to the brim of the cover, and holds the salute for 1 full quiet second for a 9-year-old boy in a Carolina Panthers cap who, on a cold gray afternoon in the Carolina pines, in a thin wet hoodie with a peanut butter sandwich in his pocket, stopped, listened, stepped off the trail, and changed the lives of 4 old Marines and 2,000 younger ones forever. Semper Fi, little brother. Semper Fi.